Thanks again for having me. It's my last talk, and it's been a really great few days. Great fellowship, great education. I've learned a great deal while I've been here, and I'm always happy to come back to Brazil. I'm going to talk about outcome assessment. One of the big things we have now in the United States, there's a lot of change in our medical system, and one of the biggest drivers now is what's referred to as value, and this is all started in the United States, sort of out of the Harvard Business School. They said we really have to look at value in medicine rather than just the what kind of surgeries we like to do. There has to be some value, just like there was in any other thing. And they say, how do you measure value? So for something to be value, it's the quality and the cost. And to measure quality, you can't just measure what the range of motion is or what the x-rays look at. The only way to really measure quality that is important to a patient, is what the patient thinks. It doesn't matter what their range of motion is if the patient thinks they aren't doing well. If the patient does not perceive themselves as being better, then it doesn't matter how many nice x-rays we have. So the standard in the United States now, across all the medical system, is to determine value, to determine our outcome. We have to ask the patient what their function is, or what their pain is, or what their depression is. We have to ask the patient these things. We have to use a patient-reported outcome to decide if the patient is better or not better. Now, this isn't really new to us in science, in all the literature that we read. Any literature that we've read for years, to judge if one procedure is better than another procedure, we have to use an outcome measure. The one that we're all familiar with, because it was one of the first one used in medicine, was the SF-36. And many of the young academics in here, many of you have started, you probably, when you started in your practice, like I started in my practice, I said, I'm going to collect an outcome measure on every patient that comes in. Every patient that comes to see me, I'm going to have them fill out an SF-36, and I'll really be able to measure their outcome. And I think this paper from Seattle that was in Spine, this really reflects what our experience was. So they decided they were routinely going to collect the SF-36 on spine patients. And they had 5,000 patients, eligible patients, where they said they asked the patients complete this SF-36. Now only half of those patients actually completed it. They asked 5,000, only 2,000 some completed it. Of that, only 1,800 patients actually completed it correctly, or completed the whole thing. They started out doing it and then stopped doing it. Only 300 patients completed it 3 times. So they did it 1 time, they come back to the office maybe after their surgery, they said, okay, I'll do it again. Come back to the office 6 months after their surgery. Only 300 patients were willing to fill out this survey 3 times. Because it's a lot of work, 36 questions, the same questions every time. We know that this was not possible to do routinely in your office. If you really wanted to use it for research, you had to have a research nurse, you had to have somebody who was really making the patients fill these out. It was just too hard. And the conclusion from this paper, and the conclusion from all of us who tried to do it in our office, was it was impossible and no value. And from the literature, we might have predicted that, because patients are like us. We don't like to do things that don't seem useful to us. So for us to be able to collect these patient-reported outcomes, it really has to be something that gives them immediate feedback. So they say, okay, there's some useful information here. I'll take this test because I'm getting useful information. And from our point of view in the office, we really can't disrupt the office. We have a lot of patients to see. It has to be smooth in the office, and we can't have a patient filling out 100 questions and taking a half an hour of their time when we're there, and it has to be cost effective. We can't have hire nurses or research assistants to collect this information on every patient. We can't afford that in the medical system. Now, a few years back, the NIH, I think, came to the rescue. The National Institutes of Health in the United States with this initiative called PROMISE. And I'm going to talk to you more about the PROMISE. But to do that, I need to give you a little bit of science, and the science of measuring outcomes. So the science of measuring outcomes is done by the scientists called psychometricians. The science is called psychometrics. And it actually began just after Darwin's theories about natural selection, because they wanted to measure people's IQ. How smart were people? So the scientists started to develop these surveys, and they developed the science around the measuring traits. The first trait they wanted to measure was IQ. But as the scientists became more and more adept at measuring things, they said, well, we can make a test to measure anything. And important for us, they say, okay, we want a test that measures physical function. The science and the math and all the science that was used to create these things was called classical test theory. That's the science that's used to create these surveys that measure traits. And about 20 years ago, in the psychometric world, there was a big paradigm shift from this thing called classical test theory to item response theory. Now, all the tests that you've heard of, all the tests that are in our literature, all of them were created using classical test theory. Classical test theory they used that to create the SF-36, the WOMAC, the musculoskeletal functional assessment. Classical test theory was used to create all those. And I said, about 20 years ago in the psychometric science world, they changed a paradigm shift to item response theory. Now, if you create a test, say a test for physical function or mobility, using classical test theory, this is how you do it. You get a bunch of experts like us to sit around and try to think up questions that will tell us about a person's physical function. You know, simple question like, can you run 5 miles? Yes or no, that tells us something about their physical function. And we sit down and we try to think up a bunch of questions that cover the range of that trait. Can you get out of bed? Can you run 10 miles? And we try to think of a lot of questions in between. So we think up a lot of questions, and then we give them to a lot of patients, and we analyze the data, and maybe we come up with this measure. For example, take the musculoskeletal functional assessment. That has 100 questions on it, a little over 100 questions. So we cover the range of trait, 100 questions. The thing is, when I create this test, it has 100 questions. The whole test is the measure. I can't just give part of the test. I have to give the whole test. So if the test has 100 questions on it, the patient has to answer all 100 questions. And they have to answer all 100 questions every time I want to know what their level of that trait is. Now, the difference with item response theory is actually very cool. That's what interested me when I first started learning about it. You begin the same way. You come up with a lot of questions, and you give the data to the patient, or you give these tests to patients, and they answer the questions, and you get this mobility measure. But instead, the difference in the math and the science is, instead of the entire test being the measure, each question is a measure. So each question that you ask can be a measure. So that, in the classical test theory, the whole test is your measure. So in classical test theory, you have this test, and they take the whole test and they get their test level. In the item response theory, rather than a test, you get this thing called an item bank. So this item bank has all the questions in it that tell me about the level of this trait. And the item bank allows you some really interesting things. So I have this item bank, and say I want to test that, I want to cover this whole range from very low to very high. Well, I can pick out 10 questions from different places in this item bank, and then I can give the patient these 10 questions, and that will cover the whole thing. But say I only have people that have a high functioning level. I can just pick 10 questions from the high range of the item bank, or the same with the questions from the low item bank. So here's the most interesting thing, though. We'll go back. If I give a classical test, I give this 120 question test. They take the thing, they score 100, and that gives me their trait level. The nice thing about item response theory and the item bank is now I can use the item bank and can put it with a computer and do a computer adapted test. And now I can say, okay, the computer is going to ask the question. So the computer says, can you run 5 miles? Yeah, I can run 5 miles. Can you run 10 miles? No, I can't run 10 miles. Can you run 7 miles? Yeah, I can run 7 miles. No, I can't run 8 miles. So in 4 or 5 questions, I can get an answer to the patient's trait level or the person's trait level with more accuracy than asking 120 questions. So in 4 questions, I can get the same answer I would, or a better answer, using 100 questions. So in 2004, the NIH said, you know, how we're measuring outcomes, it's a real mess. There's 120 different outcome measures, and none of them are created using this new science, and you can't compare one to another. And we said, we have to reorganize this whole thing. So they said, the NIH says, we're going to create all new measures, and that is in this PROMISE initiative. So the NIH said, we're going to make measures across the entire range of health. So they started creating measures for all the different areas of health. Of course, for us, the physical function is the most important, but also mental health, social health. They're creating item response theory tests that you can use with computers across this whole range of health. Now, of course, we are orthopedic surgeons, and we know that our area is the most important. So we figure we need an outcome measure for the big toe. If I'm a foot surgeon and I use this measure that I'm measuring physical function, and I say, well, that's no good because I'm a big toe surgeon and we need a special measure for the big toe. Well, you want to look and see how the NIH created this measure of physical function. So when they started, they're making this measure of physical function, and to start they said, well, let's look at what already exists. So there were 329 surveys or instruments that measured physical function. And if you added up all the questions on those instruments, there were 1,800 questions, all the questions that they asked about physical function. Well, then they went through and they eliminated the redundant questions, and they had expert review and all that. Turned out all but 168 questions were redundant. So it didn't matter if your physical function measure was for the big toe or the hip or the arm, everybody was asking the same questions. They thought they were asking different questions, but everybody was answering the same questions. And then when they gave these questions to 20,000 persons, turned out that some of the questions were no good, and it turned out you could only 125 questions. With that item bank, you could get what you needed to know about things. So now there's starting to be a lot of literature coming out, and all these different things. They've evaluated the NIH measures, the PROMISE measures, and they're better than the traditional measures. They're better for spine than the Oswestry disability, better for foot and ankle, better for upper extremity, better for total joint. The PROMISE measures work better than all the other measures. Now, so their idea is rather than having, a special measure for total hip or a special measure for feet, we're having separate measures for everything. So I can measure physical function, but if I want to get more about the patient, I can put 3 measures together. So I can measure 4 questions physical function, 4 questions for pain, 4 questions for depression. So in 15 questions, I can measure each of those traits for those patients. They've also done translation. So you can see for physical function, this is physical function, PROMISE physical function measure. This is already translated into Portuguese and all these other languages as well. But this means the full item bank has been translated into Portuguese. So there is the potential to use the computer adapted tests in Brazil. And actually, we had created this tool in the AO that allowed you to use the computer adapted tests. And we've recently teamed up with this company, Oberd, And this AO Outcome Center is going to be available worldwide now. We had it only available in the United States, but soon, hopefully in the next year, you'll be able to use these computer-adapted tests in the AO Outcome Center Now, these are going to be very valuable. We're now, in my orthopedic department, we're collecting these on all the patients. So 80%, 85% of the patients that come in through all our clinics, we collect these outcome measures at every visit. There's only a few other places in the United States that are doing it. The first place to do it was University of Utah. University of Rochester has been also involved. And this was a very interesting paper that was recently published in the New England Journal of Medicine, looking at some work that was done by Judy Baumauer at University of Rochester. And these are patients that had foot surgery, elective foot surgery. And they looked at the patients and they said, these are their scores, preoperative physical function scores, right? So on the scores, 50 is the population mean, right? So 29 means you're 2 standard deviations. Your physical function is 2 standard deviations below the population mean. So if you had a patient whose physical function was 2 standard deviations below the mean, of the population mean, and you operated on them, they were really happy. If you had a patient whose physical function score before the operation was 40, meaning they were close to the mean of the general population, and you operated on them, they were not happy with their result. So it makes sense. If you operate on somebody who isn't going to get much better, they're not going to be happy. If you operate on somebody who's going to get a lot better, they will be happy. But this shows that these measures are very good and can be useful in how we treat our patients. So in summary, I think that's going to be these PROMs, and especially the PROMIS PROMs, are going to be available all over the world. It'll allow us to compare our results over the world. So I'll say in the next few years, you should commit to using some of these easy computer-adapted tests so we can all figure out what they mean and we can all improve our care and treat patients better. So thank you very much.